The 1960s gave us more than peace signs, flower power, and moon landings. It was also the decade when war movies could get you thrown out of a cinema or see the whole reel yanked from the projector mid-show. Governments, generals, and local councils all had their scissors ready, terrified that a 2-hour film could stir rebellion or dent recruiting numbers. So, which war films were bold enough to be silenced? Strap in, because these battle reels didn't just show war. They fought one. The War Game 1966. Peter Watkins didn't just make a film. He staged a public panic drill. Shot like a BBC News special, The War Game imagined what would happen if a nuclear strike hit the county of Kent. Charred bodies, blinded civilians, and street executions were shown with such documentary precision that the BBC shelved it hours before broadcast. Officially, they called it a scheduling decision. Privately, memos revealed fears it would cause mass anxiety and public unrest. The film cost just £40,000 and was shot in black and white on handheld 16mm, making it feel disturbingly authentic. Watkins even rehearsed locals until their expressions of pain and fear were too real for comfort. Military officials complained about the casualty numbers, while church groups called it a grim warning. Strangely, it went on to win the 1967 Oscar for Best Documentary, while still being banned from TV for nearly 2 decades. Bootleg VHS copies were passed between anti-nuclear activists, screened in church basements, with audiences walking out pale and silent. The ban only gave it more power. When it finally aired in 1985, the Cold War was still simmering, and it felt as urgent as the day it was made. The War Game proved you can stop a broadcast, but you can't stop a story once fear takes hold. Second Dr. Strangelove, 1964. Stanley Kubrick's dark comedy about nuclear apocalypse wasn't everyone's idea of entertainment. Released just after the Cuban Missile Crisis, it struck too close to reality for some. Certain British military screenings had whole lines snipped, while U.S. Air Force officials tried to distance themselves from the rogue bomber crew at the heart of the plot. After President Kennedy's assassination, some theaters quietly pulled it, worried its satirical tone might look insensitive. Kubrick's genius was in making the end of the world absurd, generals bickering over a doomsday machine and a pilot riding a bomb like a rodeo bull. The humor was razor sharp, but for officials who still had their finger on the button, it was a little too sharp. The Pentagon refused any cooperation, and rumors swirled that certain B-52 cockpit scenes were too close to classified layouts. Even with the pushback, the movie became a cultural milestone, cementing phrases like mutually assured destruction into everyday talk. Its black and white cinematography and deadpan delivery only made the satire sting more. Dr. Strangelove was proof that sometimes the most dangerous weapon isn't a missile, it's a joke sharp enough to hit a nerve. Third, Patton, 1969. George C. Scott's blistering turn as General George S. Patton delivered one of cinema's most commanding performances and one of its most divisive. The 1970 epic was celebrated for its scope and storytelling, but in some corners of the U.S. military it was handled with kid gloves. Certain base theaters quietly trimmed Patton's more provocative speeches, especially the ones where he took swipes at allies or made unfiltered remarks about the enemy. Right from the opening frame, the tone was set. Patton, standing before a massive American flag, delivering a booming address to unseen troops. It was part pep talk, part verbal cannon blast. The film pulled no punches with his temper, his clashes with fellow commanders, and his unapologetic philosophy of war. For some viewers, this honesty was invigorating. For others, it was too raw to fit the image of a perfect military hero. While the Pentagon never issued a formal ban, the message was clear in certain overseas postings. Not every audience should see the full cut. In some cases, screenings were skipped entirely. Military families stationed abroad were told the unedited version was unsuitable, a label that only fueled curiosity back home. Director Franklin J. Schaffner balanced Scott's powerhouse performance with battle sequences that felt both grand and chaotic. Sweeping desert panoramas one moment, the deafening crush of tank treads the next. The result earned 8 Academy Awards, including Best Picture, cementing Patton as a Hollywood landmark. But the film's real legacy isn't just its awards, it's the way it forced audiences to reckon with a complicated truth. Sometimes, the most effective leaders are also the most abrasive. And sometimes, the most dangerous thing a soldier can carry into battle is the truth itself. 4. The Green Berets, 1968. When John Wayne set out to make the Green Berets, he wasn't aiming for nuance, he wanted a cinematic counterattack against the growing wave of Vietnam War criticism. And in 1968, that was a bold move. The film's unapologetically pro-military stance landed like a grenade in the middle of an already divided America. Protests erupted outside theaters, some countries banned it outright as propaganda, and even in the US, campus cinemas flat out refused to show it. Wayne had the full backing of the US Army. The production used real military hardware, helicopters, and soldiers from Fort Benning, giving it an authenticity that critics claimed only made the message more obvious. This was a straight-up good versus evil narrative, without the moral gray zones creeping into other Vietnam-era films. Supporters saw it as a proud salute to American troops. Detractors saw it as a recruitment ad with Hollywood lighting. The cultural climate was already toxic. Body counts on the evening news, anti-war marches on every other block, and here came Wayne with a script that treated the war as righteous. The backlash was fierce, but the box office didn't flinch. The film pulled in solid numbers, proving that plenty of Americans still wanted a story where the heroes wore green fatigues and the mission was noble. In the end, The Green Berets became more than a war movie. It was a flashpoint in the broader culture war, a film where the fiercest battles weren't on the screen, but in the arguments spilling out into the theater parking lot. 5. Oh, What a Lovely War, 1969. Richard Attenborough's directorial debut was not a mud-and-blood battlefield epic, it was a Technicolor broadside aimed squarely at the myths of World War I. Oh, What a Lovely War used jaunty music hall numbers and dazzling costumes to take apart the polished image of Britain's generals, painting them as hopelessly out of touch while ordinary soldiers marched to their doom. For some, it was a masterstroke of satire. For others, it was an insult. Several local councils in the UK refused to screen it, declaring it disrespectful to the war dead. Attenborough's approach was ruthless in its contrast. Generals strutted in bright uniforms under chandeliers, while projected casualty numbers rolled like a grim scoreboard in the background. Popular wartime tunes were repurposed into bitter commentary, making their cheerful melodies suddenly feel chilling. The coup de grace came in the final moments. A wide shot of a grassy hillside covered in endless white crosses. Fading into the horizon, many audiences sat through the credits in stunned silence. The cast was a who's who of British talent. Dirk Bogarde, Maggie Smith, John Gielgud, Laurence Olivier, playing their parts with just enough theatrical flair to make the satire sting harder. And despite pressure to soften the message, Attenborough refused to dull his film's teeth. While its controversial reception cost it certain mainstream bookings, it ensured a lasting place in cinematic history. Oh, What a Lovely War proved that a war film doesn't have to fire a single shot to wound its target. Sometimes the deadliest attack is a well-aimed laugh, especially when it's aimed at the people in charge. 6. The Bedford Incident, 1965. Cold War paranoia was already simmering when James B. Harris delivered The Bedford Incident, a taut naval thriller that felt less like entertainment and more like classified footage smuggled onto the big screen. The plot followed an American destroyer and a Soviet submarine locked in an unblinking game of cat and mouse, two steel predators circling each other in the icy North Atlantic. The suspense built with military precision right up to a devastating climax. But not everyone got to see that ending. On certain U.S. Navy bases, the final minutes were cut, stripping away the gut punch twist and replacing it with something far less rattling. Sidney Poitier brought quiet intensity as a civilian journalist along for the ride, while Richard Widmark's captain was all steel nerves and unyielding authority. His brand of command, unyielding, confrontational, and relentlessly aggressive, was gripping to watch but uncomfortably familiar to anyone who'd served under similar leadership. That familiarity was part of the problem. The film's stark black and white photography, combined with Harris's tight, claustrophobic framing, made viewers feel the walls of the ship closing in. The ever-present sonar pings became a heartbeat for the crew and for the audience. In real life, naval standoffs had already flirted dangerously with disaster, and the Bedford incident mirrored those scenarios a little too closely for some military tastes. For families and sailors who saw the edited version, the edge was dulled, the warning muted. In the 1960s, it wasn't just the enemy you didn't want to see staring back at you, it was the reflection in your own steel hull. 7. The Long and the Short and the Tall, 1961. Adapted from Willis Hall's hit West End play, The Long and the Short and the Tall took World War II out of the parade ground and dropped it deep into the oppressive Malayan jungle. What started as a routine patrol quickly spiraled into a tense standoff, not with the enemy, but within the unit itself. Moral conflict, fear, and outright disobedience simmered under every line of dialogue. The British Army was less than impressed. In certain garrison towns, local councils blocked screenings altogether, worried the film's unvarnished portrayal would chip away at the Army's carefully polished image. Lawrence Harvey anchored a cast that also included Richard Harris and David McCallum, each playing men on the edge. Instead of celebrating gallantry, the film stripped away the heroics, showing soldiers as fallible, frustrated, and sometimes downright insubordinate. For an establishment accustomed to war films doubling as recruitment posters, this was near heretical. Director Leslie Norman shot much of the action in tight, airless interiors designed to mimic the suffocating jungle heat. Sweat dripped, tempers flared, and the atmosphere grew heavier by the minute. Viewers weren't just watching a patrol, they were trapped in it. Critics praised the realism, but the bans in certain military-heavy areas only added to its underground reputation. Word spread that this wasn't the kind of war movie where the bugles called and everyone went home a hero. It was the kind that left you uneasy. In the end, The Long and the Short and the Tall proved a simple truth. On the battlefield, the hardest fights aren't always with the enemy. Sometimes they're with the man standing next to you. And showing that to the public? That's the sort of honesty that makes gatekeepers reach for the scissors. 8. The Hill, 1965. Sidney Lumet. The Hill wasn't a story of charging into battle, it was about the kind of fight that grinds a man down from the inside. Set in a British Army prison camp in North Africa during World War II, it followed soldiers being punished not for cowardice or treason, but for failing to meet the rigid expectations of the system. The punishment was brutal in its simplicity, climbing a steep, man-made hill of sand and rock again and again under the blazing sun, until men collapsed from sheer exhaustion. The film's combination of unflinching cruelty, institutional abuse, and racial tension proved too much for some markets. It was banned in South Africa and censored in parts of the Middle East, where its depiction of authority as oppressive and sometimes sadistic hit too close to political realities. Sean Connery, fresh off global fame as James Bond, took a major career gamble by playing Joe Roberts, a defiant prisoner refusing to break. Lumet shot the film in scorching heat, with temperatures so high that members of the cast and crew genuinely collapsed during takes. That authenticity bled into the performances, leaving no room for Hollywood gloss. There's no triumphant ending here, only the grinding machinery of power crushing individuals under its weight. Lumet used stark black and white photography and long, tense takes to make the audience feel the same suffocating pressure the characters endured. Military officials disliked the film's message, that the real enemy could be the uniform itself. For those who saw it uncut, The Hill was unforgettable. It was proof that war's most harrowing battles can take place far from gunfire, in places soldiers are supposed to call safe, but where survival still comes down to endurance and will. 9. The Victors, 1963. Carl Foreman's sprawling anti-war epic didn't flinch from showing the moral compromises of Allied troops during World War II, and it paid for that honesty with the censor's blade. Scenes depicting the execution of a deserter and a biting Christmas sequence set to "Have Yourself a Merry Little Christmas" over images of war dead pushed censors over the edge. Some U.S. states cut whole sequences, and foreign markets demanded trims before release. Shot across multiple countries with a cast including George Peppard, Peter Fonda, and Eli Wallach, The Victors wasn't a flag-waving march, it was a dirge. Its episodic structure meant audiences saw war from many angles, few of them flattering. Foreman, himself blacklisted in the 1950s, knew the risk of telling uncomfortable truths. The controversy overshadowed the film's craftsmanship, from its haunting cinematography to its deliberate pacing. cuts didn't just remove shock, they weakened the film's central argument that victory can come at a terrible cost. Even today, the uncut version is harder to find, making it a lost jewel of war cinema that once had officials scrambling for the scissors. 10th. King and Country, 1964. Joseph Losey's King and Country took audiences to the sodden trenches of World War I, where the mud was as relentless as the military bureaucracy. The film followed a shell-shocked soldier put on trial for desertion, played with heartbreaking vulnerability by Tom Courtenay. Dirk Bogart's officer, tasked with defending him, brought equal weight, balancing compassion with a growing disillusionment in the system. Losey refused to soften the setting. Mud, rats, and the constant grind of trench life seeped into every frame, hammering home the point that the real enemy often wasn't across no man's land, but behind the lines in a courtroom. That unflinching approach worried authorities in certain Commonwealth countries. Some feared the film would weaken faith in the chain of command, especially among serving soldiers. Bans followed, along with whispered debates about how much truth was too much. The stripped-down sets and suffocating close-ups created a claustrophobic inevitability, making the verdict feel like it had been decided before the trial began. It wasn't a loud film, it was a slow, deliberate indictment of a system that could sacrifice its own to save face. For those who saw it uncut, King and Country lingered long after the credits. It proved that war films don't need sweeping battle scenes to wound. Sometimes the quietest stories leave the deepest mark, whispering truths that ripple out into the present. 11th. Morituri, 1965. Morituri was a tense World War II espionage story with more shadows than explosions. Marlon Brando played a German anti-Nazi forced to infiltrate a blockade runner, while Yul Brynner captained the suspicious crew. The U.S. Navy didn't appreciate how the film depicted sabotage at sea, worried it might inspire real-life tactics. As a result, some base theaters skipped it entirely, and overseas military installations received heavily edited reels. Director Bernhard Wicki built the suspense through claustrophobia, narrow corridors, constant suspicion, and dim lighting that kept the audience guessing. Brando's performance was deliberately restrained, making his undercover role feel credible. The authenticity extended to the ship's operations, which some said were a little too close to actual wartime procedures for comfort. When it hit theaters, Morituri struggled at the box office. Audiences expecting a big, action-heavy war movie instead got a slow-burn psychological duel. But for those who appreciated its moral complexity and layered tension, it became a quiet favorite. The censored versions lost much of that slow build, trimming away the very moments that made the suspense work. In the end, Morituri proved that in wartime storytelling, it's not always the gunfire that rattles the powers that be, it's the dangerous power of ideas. 12. The Charge of the Light Brigade, 1968. Tony Richardson's The Charge of the Light Brigade didn't glorify one of Britain's most famous military actions, it tore it down. Instead of noble heroism, Richardson highlighted the blunders of the High Command through biting satire and even animated sequences mocking the generals. That sharp edge didn't go over well in some Commonwealth countries, where parts of the dialogue and entire caricature scenes were cut before release. The film balanced large-scale battle scenes with political commentary, making generals appear more like puffed-up bureaucrats than battlefield leaders. Those comedic jabs at authority were the first to hit the cutting room floor in sensitive regions, leaving a more conventional but less impactful war film. With a cast including Trevor Howard, Vanessa Redgrave, and David Hemmings, the acting stayed strong even when the satire was blunted. Richardson's mix of pageantry and criticism was deliberate. He wanted audiences to see the pomp and the cost side by side. For those lucky enough to catch it uncut, The Charge of the Light Brigade wasn't just a war movie, it was a political statement, sabers drawn not only at the enemy but at the leaders who sent their own men into disaster. 13. 7 Days in May, 1964. John Frankenheimer's 7 Days in May was a Cold War political thriller with no battlefield in sight but plenty of tension. It imagined a near-future military coup in the United States, led by a decorated general played by Burt Lancaster. Kirk Douglas, as the officer trying to stop him, found himself in a chess game of conspiracies, coded messages, and tight deadlines. The Pentagon refused to cooperate, and some theaters near military bases reported quiet pressure not to show the film. In an era where the public's trust in its leaders was a matter of national security, depicting a high-ranking general plotting against the president was considered risky. Frankenheimer's use of tight framing, muted colors, and low-key performances gave the story a documentary-like realism. It felt plausible, too plausible for some. The lack of official bans didn't make the avoidance any less real. The limited screenings in sensitive areas were censorship in practice, if not in name. 7 Days in May remains a reminder that in the Cold War, the scariest threats weren't always foreign. They could be sitting in the highest offices in the land. 14th Battle of the Bulge, 1965. Battle of the Bulge came loaded with tanks, snow, and star power. Henry Fonda, Robert Shaw, and Telly Savalas among them. It aimed to be an epic retelling of one of World War II's most famous battles. Instead, it drew fire for its historical inaccuracy. Veterans groups in the US and Europe blasted the film for its liberties with timelines, geography, and even the weather. The Spanish locations bore little resemblance to the real Ardennes. Some theaters pulled it early, while foreign distributors cut whole sections to soften the offense to military pride. Despite the criticism, the film delivered spectacle. The widescreen tank battles and booming orchestral score had undeniable cinematic punch. But the controversy overshadowed its craftsmanship, with debates over whether the dramatic license had gone too far. In the end, Battle of the Bulge proved that even in war movies, accuracy can be a battlefield all its own, one where filmmakers sometimes lose the fight before the credits roll. 15. Tunes of Glory, 1960. Ronald Neam's Tunes of Glory traded gunfire for psychological warfare inside a Scottish regiment's officers' mess. Alec Guinness played the charismatic but volatile commanding officer, while John Mills portrayed his more restrained replacement. Their clash built slowly into a power struggle that turned toxic. Its depiction of insubordination and the darker side of military culture was too much for some territories. Singapore banned it, and British colonies cut scenes they felt might undermine respect for the chain of command. Neam kept the drama tight, using the mess hall as a pressure cooker, where every formal dinner and passing remark carried the weight of a duel. Guinness delivered one of his most layered performances, proud, insecure, and dangerous when challenged. By the time the final act arrived, the conflict had escalated beyond salvage. The censored versions muted much of that tension, stripping away key character moments. Uncut Tunes of Glory was a stark reminder that the war doesn't always end when the shooting stops. It just moves indoors. From nukes hitting English towns to coup plots in Washington, these films didn't just tell war stories. They waged their own battles against scissors bans and backroom pressure. Some were pulled for being too real, others for being too wrong, but all share one thing. They made the powerful uncomfortable. Which one do you think deserved its censorship, and which one should have been left alone? Drop your pick in the comments, hit subscribe, and remember, sometimes the fight isn't on the battlefield, it's in the projection booth.